Yeah, it's kind of weird seeing Murtazaliev's name ahead of Tszyu. What's good? It's Woog. We've got Bakhram Murtazaliev, 22 wins and 0 losses, defending his newly won IBF 154-pound title against Tszyu, 24 wins and 1 loss. Tszyu is the former WBO 154-pound champion, which he just lost against Sebastian Fundora, and we're going to get to that bloody, gruesome, unfortunate fight in terms of how much the fight was impacted. And I really wanted Tszyu and Sebastian Fundora to run that back. Sebastian Fundora won via split decision in a fight where Tszyu was bloodied badly. Like, I would have to think back to maybe Marcus Brown versus Bout Jack, where Bout Jack had that vertical cut on his forehead. I would have to think to maybe a fight like that to think of a fight that was as bloody as Tszyu versus Sebastian Fundora after Fundora inadvertently hit Tszyu with the elbow. I mean, that would have been a beautiful UFC shot, the elbow coming up as Tszyu came in. People get caught with that in the UFC, but it opened up a cut on the top of Tszyu's head, just caused a cut to be pouring down blood over his face, making his face a bloody mess throughout much of that fight. I thought that Tszyu was largely blinded in big spots in that fight. And that cut, even after the fight, has kept Tszyu out of the ring for several months. Now, Tszyu got his as well, and he bloodied up Sebastian Fundora's nose to the point where Fundora has been out of action for several months while he's healing from that Tszyu fight. So although Tszyu lost that fight, I don't feel like all losses are equal in terms of what they can do to a fighter psychologically going forward. I actually think that the way that Tszyu fought and persevered through that cut and made it such a competitive fight despite being a bloody mask throughout that fight, I feel like there's a lot that you can gain from that going forward. Whereas, if somebody got beat down, say like Callum Smith versus Artur Beterbiev, or if Miguel Cotto's first fight versus Antonio Margarito, where Margarito bludgeoned, battered, and stopped Miguel Cotto after Miguel Cotto had a few good early rounds, if that fight wasn't marred with what became of Margarito's career with the hand plaster and basically being a recognized cheater in the sport, if that was legit and there wasn't this cloud of, well, was Margarito cheating in that fight against Cotto, I could see how that fight could have had a psychological impact on Cotto. And quite frankly, I don't know, Cotto must be made of some tough stuff to be able to endure that fight, receive the beating that he took in that fight, and then go on to have the rest of his career in the way that he did. Like, that's really a testament to the human spirit. But I'm saying that to point out that that type of a beatdown could be discouraging to a fighter's self-belief, confidence, all those things going forward. Whereas again, Tszyu, even though he lost his WBO title and gained his first loss, his first career loss in that fight against Fundora, because of the way the fight went down, I don't look at that as being one of those fights that ruin your career potentially. And before that, I mean, Tszyu had all the momentum in the world. Like, he was becoming one of my favorite fighters because I really was excited about the idea of a then undisputed 154-pound champ Jermell Charlo fighting Tszyu. But because of an injury that Jermell Charlo sustained to his hand that first postponed that fight between him and Tszyu, because the fight was scheduled once upon a time, it ended up being postponed. And when Jermell Charlo eventually did come back, he ended up fighting Canelo Alvarez. So Jermell Charlo versus Tszyu just didn't happen. But in the meantime, while Jermell Charlo, before he even scheduled that fight with Canelo, while he was healing from that injury, instead of just sitting back and keeping his mandatory #1 contender spot, Tszyu instead opted to stay busy, and not only to stay busy, but to fight good fighters, including the guy who had previously beaten Jermell Charlo in Tony Harrison. So Tszyu stays busy, stops Tony Harrison, stops Carlos Ocampo. In the lead up to that Ocampo fight, Tszyu suffers a dog bite that looked like it could have derailed that fight, but he went on and went forward with the fight, even though he got a nasty gash due to that bite. Knocks out Ocampo in like the first round. Then he beats down in a pretty competitive, good fight against Brian Mendoza, who was coming off of a knockout win against Sebastian Fundora, and before that a good knockout against Jason Rosario. So this is before Brian Mendoza got beat down on short notice by Sergey Bohachuk. Brian Mendoza was kind of surging when he fought Tim Tszyu. So yeah, Tim Tszyu fighting Tony Harrison, Carlos Ocampo, and Brian Mendoza instead of just waiting around for that shot at undisputed, while also becoming the WBO 154-pound champ, because Jermell Charlo eventually got stripped of that WBO belt. So Tim Tszyu earned that in the meantime as well. So yeah, Tim Tszyu just seemed like a fighter who was willing to fight anybody, just wanting to prove that he's the best, didn't care who the opponent was. Let's do it, let's do it, let's do it. How can you not like that as a fight fan? Especially because there was a lot of skepticism with Tim Tszyu. I remember watching him beat up on like Jeff Horn and other fighters back in Australia. He beat up on Steve Sparks, stopped him in like the third round, TKO Dennis Hogan in 5 rounds. Dennis Hogan once upon a time outboxed Jaime Munguia and was arguably robbed. It was a controversial, disputed type decision that Munguia won against Dennis Hogan a couple years before that. But yeah, Tim Tszyu was looking really good, but he was still fighting regionally. So there was skepticism on, okay, so what happens when he starts fighting, you know, elite and near elite fighters? I know Jeff Horn has a win over Manny Pacquiao, but Jeff Horn, I thought by the time he was fighting, you know, the fights against Michael Zarafa, I thought that he was already kind of fading. So Tim Tszyu was looking spectacular regionally, but it's like, what's going to happen when he starts really stepping it up? And when he did make his debut in the United States against Terrell Goucher, he didn't look spectacular. He got dropped early, ended up winning a clear decision, but he didn't look as scintillating as he did in those regional fights. So going into the Tony Harrison fight, a lot of people thought that Harrison was going to give him problems, and Harrison ends up getting stopped in the 9th round. So Tim Tszyu's being somebody who's more of a I could show you better than I could tell you type of fighter, and I dig that. But I think the question going into this fight is, does Murtazaliev have like a really good shot at beating Tim Tszyu, or is he more or less an opponent who got a fortuitous opportunity after being a long time mandatory contender for the IBF belt? Jermell Charlo at the time's IBF belt, he was kind of getting paid off to step aside while Jermell Charlo was pursuing undisputed, first against, I believe, Jason Rosario, and then in those 2 fights against Brian Mendoza to collect the last of the 4 major belts. So Murtazaliev instead was fighting, you know, somewhat lower level, not somewhat, but lower level opponents, while he was just kind of biding his time, making his step aside money, waiting for an eventually opportunity to fight for the IBF title. Well, he finally got that in a vacant title bout against Jack Culcay, who back in like 2017, I believe, fought a really good split decision loss against Demetrius Andrade. So Jack Culcay isn't a bad fighter. The guys who he had lost to were, again, Andrade. He had lost to Sulechki, Derevianchenko. So this is somebody who's beating the guys if you're not like an elite or near elite fighter. So Jack Culcay was a good fighter, but he was like 38, 39 by the time he was going into that Murtazaliev fight. So, you know, because it wasn't like a highly billed or just, it wasn't a hugely promoted fight for that vacant IBF 154-pound title. It was more or less just business that had to be conducted. So I get the impression that a lot of fight fans didn't even really see that fight. I think a lot of people read about the result of the fight and figured, okay, Murtazaliev probably beat up on Jack Culcay, won the title via 11th round knockout. But if you watch that fight, that was a competitive fight. In fact, through 7 rounds, the unofficial scorecard had Culcay up 4 rounds to 3. After 10 rounds, it was 5-5 on the unofficial scorecard. This is going into the 11th round that resulted in the knockout. So there was a first round should have been knocked down. Culcay stepped into a Murtazaliev punch, got off knocked while he was off balance, fell on the canvas. They called it a slip. That should have been a knockdown. But although early in the fight, it was looking like Murtazaliev, who's a tall fighter. Murtazaliev is 6 feet to Jack Culcay's 5'7". Think about that, 6 feet against 5'7". It was looking like Murtazaliev was going to be too long and strong for Jack Culcay, the 39-year-old. But Culcay, by the 4th round, 5th round, he was really battling back and making the fight kind of a 50-50 fight, where Murtazaliev got caught up in all these long exchanges where they're just exchanging hooks, and the much shorter Jack Culcay was blasting Murtazaliev, where in the middle rounds, I got the impression that if anybody was really wilting, it looked like it might have been Murtazaliev. He was getting caught so cleanly. It's like Culcay was able to kind of get under Murtazaliev and punch upward and just continuously catch Murtazaliev with left hands, right hands. And Murtazaliev, although he's a tall fighter, he's not somebody who's doing a tremendous job at controlling range with a hard jab or anything. He more or less uses his left jab as a pop, so he could set up a big right hand. It's more like a not even a pop, more like a tap, big right hand. So he throws a lot of overhand chopping rights, sweeping hooks. He's throwing a lot of power punches. Doesn't appear to be a great defensive fighter. He's got good power. I wouldn't say he's got tremendous power. He's got good power, but again, not a great defensive fighter, doesn't control range. And I'm thinking, you know, you're about to fight Tszyu, one of the most economical fighters, and somebody who doesn't waste a lot of punches, somebody who seems to be very purposeful in his movement, in his feints, and in his punch selection. So Tszyu, who isn't a tall fighter, he's not 5'7", but he's like 5'9". He's going to be able, I believe, to get under Murtazaliev and to jab to the body, because look, when Murtazaliev seemed like he was hurt the most against Culcay, it wasn't when he was getting caught super cleanly up top, even though his head was getting rocked back and forth when he was eating those shots, but it was when Culcay made a determined effort to go hard to the body that I saw Murtazaliev's body language really change up and start to kind of go backwards, like he was kind of doubling over and about to kind of go into the ropes. I thought that Murtazaliev was in trouble a couple times due to some of that body attack. But this really ended up being like a battle of attrition, to where both guys are just throwing kind of slowed down power punches, kind of a rock'em sock'em affair. And Murtazaliev ended up being the more durable and ended up outlasting and stopping Jack Culcay, the 39-year-old, in the 11th round. And aside from Jack Culcay, I would say his best opponent, Murtazaliev's best opponents, have been Roberto Valenzuela Jr., maybe Chiari Gray, or Jorge Fortea. So not a good set of opponents, pretty much C-level guys at best. So back to the question, does Murtazaliev have a good chance against Tszyu? I think that maybe in spots he could give Tszyu some issues with his activity, but he doesn't have the relentless, persistent attack of like a Sebastian Fundora, especially when you start getting into the phone booth range of fighting. Murtazaliev likes to throw his punches from far away or in mid-range. Sebastian Fundora could go mid-range, he could go long when he sticks that jab out, or he could go nearly chest to chest, where Fundora really starts shortening his punches. Murtazaliev doesn't do a ton of shortening his punches. He's not the most accurate puncher. There were a lot of big looping power shots that he was throwing against Culcay that were missing, where if it was somebody else, like, I mean, it's an extreme example, but like a Canelo, if you swing big continuously and are missing against Canelo, it's only a matter of time before he takes your head off, like he did against James Kirkland back in the day. Tszyu, I feel if you over pursue him and you're not accurate or super purposeful with your punch selection, I feel like Tszyu's got a good enough IQ to where he could set you up with something big. And he's got a pressure style where it's not punch heavy, but it's psychological in the way that he feints and kind of keeps you on edge, thinking this guy is like a little great white. He could unleash at any moment. Is it going to be here? No, that's just a feint. Is it going to be here? No, he's just walking you down. Boom, then he finally throws like a right hand or something. So Tszyu, again, very economical, and I'm just thinking with Murtazaliev's style, where he likes to throw a lot of power punches without establishing and controlling rounds with the jab, you don't want to get into a firefight with Tszyu if you don't have equal or greater artillery. And it's really anybody's guess on as to what would have happened with Sebastian Fundora had it not been for that devastating cut towards the end of the third round, which another one of the narratives coming out of that Tszyu-Fundora fight was that Tszyu's corner should have stopped the fight, should have pulled him from the fight when it could have still been a no contest, rather than letting the fight go on long enough to where they would then go to the scorecards and leaving Tim Tszyu vulnerable to lose his title and lose his undefeated record in that fight. So I know Tim Tszyu is kind of a no regrets type of guy, but his corner should have been more cognizant of that situation, just given the magnitude of the blood coming down. I mean, there were times in that fight where I was wondering, is Tim Tszyu gonna weaken due to blood loss? Like, it was that nasty. But yeah, I'm not even convinced that Fundora is good enough to beat Tim Tszyu without that type of a cut and injury taking place in the fight. Again, I thought that Tim Tszyu's vision was very compromised. You know, the only time, because in the second half of the fight, I didn't think there was a moment where Tim Tszyu looked like, whoa, did his legs go? It looks like he's on the verge of getting stopped. I didn't see that out of Tim Tszyu. It didn't look like he got wobbled like that. The time that I thought that he might get stopped was when he looked like he clearly couldn't see. It was like the fourth round or something, and Fundora was just putting it on him, and he was backing Tim Tszyu up towards the ropes because it just looked like, hell, I can't see. I can't find the guy. I'm taking hella shots, and this guy throws like 80 plus punches around. I was thinking at that point, maybe this results in a stoppage. But again, there is kind of a moral victory if this didn't do, you know, assuming that the cut heals, because again, it took several months for him to recover from that cut. He had to pull out of the Virgil Ortiz Jr. fight because the cut hadn't healed. But assuming that there's nothing that we don't see psychologically that might have happened to Tim Tszyu in that fight, again, I think that there's a lot of positive to pull from, being how competitive he made that bloody war against Fundora. So to answer the question, I really don't think Murtazaliev has a great shot here. Even if he gets the better of some exchanges early or has his moments where he's landing some nice shots in those combinations that he throws, given the height advantage and his ability and willingness to just let these power punches go, that I think can work to a certain point. But I do think he's going to get caught with something big, and I do think that there will be some determined effort or recognition that the body might be the key to quicker success for Tim Tszyu. I could see Tim Tszyu weakening Murtazaliev to the body, discouraging Murtazaliev, starting to back him up, and eventually finishing Murtazaliev. So yeah, I'm taking Tim Tszyu via stoppage here to regain a share of the 154-pound title. In this case, the IBF instead of the WBO. And again, hopefully, depending on what happens with Fundora versus Errol Spence for Fundora's belt, but there's a lot going on at 154, and with the titles in particular. Like, Terrence Crawford was supposed to be next up, the next mandatory for Fundora's belt. So that would have been a unification belt. It would have been for Terrence Crawford's WBA belt and Fundora's WBO and I believe WBC belt. But since Terrence Crawford, he decided to forego that opportunity against Fundora, that essentially gave the blessing for Fundora to go ahead with the fight against Errol Spence. So that's going to be for 2 of those 154-pound titles. Again, Terrence Crawford has the WBA belt, and then the IBF belt is up for grabs between Murtazaliev and Tim Tszyu. So look, I know Tim Tszyu lost that fight technically against Fundora. I still kind of look at Tim Tszyu perhaps as being the best fighter at 154. I know Terrence Crawford is there and had that really good fight with Madrimov, who is about to, I think that they just scheduled Madrimov versus Sergey Bohachuk. And boy, that's a tough draw for both guys. Like, Bohachuk, a lot of people thought should have gotten at least maybe a draw or a decision win against Virgil Ortiz Jr. I would have been fine with the draw in that one, but they gave the win to Virgil Ortiz Jr. I mean, there were 2 knockdowns in that fight, and that was Bohachuk knocking Ortiz down. But yeah, that fight really could have gone either way. And Terrence Crawford was pushed by Madrimov more than a lot of people expected him to. Some people thought that that fight was going to be really competitive. I thought that it was going to be interesting to see how Terrence Crawford handles a boxer with the strength and style of Madrimov. But I thought Crawford won a close fight in that one. It wasn't easy, but I thought that he won the fight. But there's just so much cooking at 154. I would say the only negative is that Terrence Crawford doesn't seem to want to participate really in the division. Like, he doesn't seem like he's interested in gathering the belts. Obviously, he didn't decide to fight Fundora. I wouldn't be surprised if there's no fight that Terence Crawford will accept other than a showdown up at 168 with Canelo Alvarez. Maybe that's all he wants. Or maybe if Teofimo Lopez or a Ryan Garcia was serious about fighting Terence Crawford, maybe Terence Crawford takes the bag essentially in those types of fights against big names. But he doesn't seem to have an appetite at this stage of his career. He's like 37 years old to want to fight divisionally in the mix with these other younger lions at 154. And then there's Jermell Charlo, where, I mean, Jermall looks like he's going to be fighting or returning to the ring before Jermell returns to the ring, which is interesting because ever since that Canelo fight, Jermell Charlo's just been off the map. Like, nothing, radio silence from Jermell Charlo. Whereas before that, he seemed like one of those guys who are the proverbial striving for greatness guys, becoming undisputed at 154, going up to fight Canelo. I know that the performance was what the performance was, but Jermell Charlo, a lot of people really believe in that guy. And then again, he just kind of disappears after the Canelo fight. So if he does return, I don't know if it's going to be at 154 in his mid 30s now, or if he's going to go up for 160, or if he's just looking for one or two more big paydays before calling it a career. I don't tend to think that he's going to want to jump, just kind of get back into the mud at 154 and fight like a Madrimov or a Bohachuk or, you know, Jesus Ramos, one of these, you know, other guys at 154. I don't think that he's really interested in that. And since he doesn't have a belt, I don't think Terence Crawford would be interested in fighting him. So I don't know what's up with Jermell Charlo. Like, he's not even in the rankings because it's been so long since he's competed at 154. He hasn't fought at 154 since that undisputed champ crowning performance, and that was what, like 2022? I think it was like the middle of 2022. So yeah, Jermell Charlo, anyone's guess. But aside from that, and aside from Terence Crawford, who again, I don't think is an active participant in the division, you've got Madrimov, Fundora, Virgil Ortiz Jr., Tim Tszyu. I would still like to see Jermell Charlo versus Tim Tszyu, but I would also like Jermell Charlo to take another fight before jumping in with somebody that good and that dangerous. Somebody to just kind of get you back in the ring and get your confidence back, get some rounds in, see where you are. And then you've got Bohachuk, Jesus Ramos, who lost that disputed decision against Erickson Lubin. You've got Erickson Lubin, Charles Conwell, still got Brian Mendoza, even though he's taken a couple beatings as of late. And you've got Murtazaliev. So yeah, 154 is really cooking, but let me know what you think about this upcoming fight between Murtazaliev and Tim Tszyu. Who do you have winning that one, and how? And what do you think the aftermath of that fight divisionally should look like? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.